Hello everyone. Welcome to Postcard Buddhism, the best channel for sharing knowledge about Buddhism. Today, we will talk about the topic, the decline of Buddhism in India. Despite its glorious beginnings and immense influence, Buddhism eventually faded from its birthplace. In this episode, we will explore the internal and external factors that led to the rapid decline of Buddhism in India and reflect on the historical consequences of this significant shift. Why did Buddhism decline in India? Many people wonder about the disappearance of Buddhism in India, the land where it was born and reached its zenith. Therefore, we have translated this article by an Indian author who grew up in a Hindu society from the perspective of a modern scholar to present to you. The disappearance of Buddhism in India, where it was born, flourished, and achieved its highest accomplishments, is a surprising and painful phenomenon. How and why Buddhism did not last long among those closest to it is a puzzling issue with many differing opinions. The common viewpoint among Indian scholars is the neglect and moral and spiritual decline of Buddhist monks and nuns. However, from a historical perspective, the claim that the moral decline of the Buddhist Sangha led to its downfall seems baseless and lacks credible evidence. As Swami Vivekananda said, that Buddhism had to die a natural death in India because the disciples of the Buddha rejected the eternal God, is not accurate. If that were the reason, why did Jainism survive in India when Mahavira also did not acknowledge a supreme God? Jain followers, like Buddhists, do not accept the authority of the Vedic scriptures. Thus, this is not the reason for the decline of Buddhism in India. In our view, Buddhism did not die a natural death, and the reasons for its disappearance are external rather than internal. Moreover, a systematic and calculated campaign was conducted for the selfish interests of Brahmanism to push Buddhism out of its birthplace. The reason is that the Buddha condemned the caste system and emphasized the equality of all people. Meanwhile, the followers of Brahmanism defended the caste system to maintain their privileges within that division, but Buddhist followers, unlike Jain followers, did not compromise on this issue. This led to conflicts. The Brahmins launched a campaign against Buddhism, persecuting Buddhist followers, while incorporating the good points of Buddhism into their system to persuade the masses. These external factors, combined with some internal mistakes, quickly led to the decline of Buddhism in India. Conflict between Brahmanism and Buddhism. Before Buddhism, India had never known the principles of equality and brotherhood. According to the Purusha Sukta of the Rig Veda, the Brahmin caste was born from the mouth, the Kshatriya caste from the arms, the Vaishya caste from the thighs, and the Shudra caste from the feet of Brahma, the creator god. This society was founded on the mythological origins of Chaturvarna and regulated by the principle of caste discrimination. The Brahmins were ranked highest, followed by the Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and the Shudras as the lowest. The rules of caste discrimination also dictated their rights and privileges. Even punishments for crimes were based on caste differences, with Brahmins receiving the lightest punishments and Shudras the heaviest. Thus, the entire social structure was based on the principle of inequality. The Buddha revolutionized against these oppressive social rules and condemned the caste system. He did not acknowledge the divine origin of the castes and exposed the falsehood of the Brahmin claim that they were born from the mouth of Brahma. He rejected the Brahmin assertion that only they could achieve spiritual virtues and affirmed that people of any caste, color, or creed could develop such virtues within themselves. He went further. Ensure that no one, male or female, of any social or economic background, is hindered on their path to perfection. It is each person's right and inner ability to achieve perfection through their own continuous efforts, not through the assistance of another person, deity, or supernatural force. The Buddha also taught that all people are alike, and dividing them artificially is foolish. In the Visakha Sutta, he said that in the life of animals there are differences based on different fundamental characteristics. The same is true for the life of plants. But there are no such differences in categorizing humans into separate compartments because humanity is one and has the same characteristics. Thus, the Buddha firmly stated, values are based on actions, not birth, which is an accidental event and not a measure of a person. He also took concrete steps to eradicate the caste evil. These steps were exposing the myth of the Brahmin's superior origin, encouraging the lower castes by accepting meals at their homes, and accepting low-caste individuals into the monastic community and treating them equally with others in the Sangha. Encouraging the monks to forget their caste origins, the Buddha once said, "Just as the rivers, the Ganges, Yamuna, Atsiravati, Sarasvati, and Mahi all merge into the great ocean, so do the four castes, Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra. When they follow the Dharma and discipline of the Tathagata, they abandon their caste distinctions and rankings and become members of one unified community." In India, during the 6th century BCE, the Brahmins sought salvation and liberation through sacrificial rituals. The followers of Jainism and Ajivika practiced self-mortification. In contrast, the Buddha taught his disciples to overcome the ocean of suffering by bringing goodness to other beings instead of harming them or themselves. He taught the path to nirvana through means of 1. Self-control, self-restraint, and minimizing desires. 2. Cultivating love for all beings, humans, birds, and animals. 3. Helping the poor and weak. He also emphasized A. Equal opportunities for everyone, B. Equal status for everyone, C. Freedom of thought, and D. Universal brotherhood. When the Buddha preached his Dharma, it attracted people from all walks of life, rich and poor, high and low, noble and humble. Brahmins were not excluded. Indeed, many of the Buddha's close disciples were from the Brahmin caste. Even later, some leading lights in Buddhism were former Brahmins. In the subsequent centuries, the Buddha's social teachings propelled Indian society forward, and the lower castes asserted their equality, leading the Brahmins to turn against Buddhism. The Brahmins did not oppose Buddhism on philosophical or ethical grounds, but they disliked the idea of equality in Buddhism. As Dr. Ambedkar said, "Inequality is the official doctrine of Brahmanism." The Buddha opposed its roots and branches. He was a staunch opponent of the caste system and the strongest pillar of the spirit of equality. There was no argument on the caste issue that he did not refute. Encouraged by the Buddha's teachings on equality, the lower castes asserted their freedom and opposed Brahmin supremacy, weakening the caste system's foundations and bringing the Brahmins down to the ground. When Buddhism weakened a little, the Brahmins used every means to regain their lost power and prestige. They not only tried to restore the caste system but also sought to eradicate the Buddhist teachings from India. As Hardayal said, the priests eliminated the Pali language from India. They did not merely hate Pali in terms of its doctrines, philosophy, or the Buddha's precepts. They recognized the Buddha as a great teacher and revered him. But they wanted the Buddha's wonderful teachings not to be heard in India, as those teachings had the power to destroy the citadel of caste. They said, "Even if Pali perishes, even if India perishes, our caste must hold leadership." To combat Buddhism, the Brahmins made several adjustments to their teachings. They abandoned animal sacrifices. They also renounced the doctrine that the Vedas were infallible. However, regarding the caste system, Chaturvarna, they did not yield. They had to acknowledge the impact of the Buddha's arguments against Chaturvarna. Thus, they launched a philosophical adjustment for Chaturvarna found in the Bhagavad Gita, a work predating the Buddha. As P.L. Narasu stated in The Essence of Buddhism, the primary purpose of the Gita was to clandestinely support the leadership and prestige of the Brahmin caste, born to meet the needs satisfied by Buddhism. Whatever is noble and splendid in the Gita is what Brahmanism borrowed from its rival and used for its purposes, particularly to prevent the Shudras from abandoning their ancient beliefs. The rest is a mass of repetitions, contradictions, and absurdities, resulting from an unsuccessful attempt to harmonize all aspects of traditional views. The Bhagavad Gita's primary aim was to protect and strengthen the caste system, evident in the interpretation of the word dharma. In the Vedas, dharma means rituals or ceremonies. In the Gita and Manusmriti, dharma means the duties of the four castes in the world. In the Gita, Krishna tells Arjuna to fight because it is his caste duty, dharma. He further says, "Better to die fulfilling one's caste duty. Performing the duties of another caste is dangerous." Buddhists, however, did not abandon their opposition to the idea of Chaturvarna. This was the primary reason for the conflict between Buddhism and Brahmanism. Dr. Ambedkar traced the origin of the conflict between Buddhism and Brahmanism to another source. He said, Reading through the entire Buddhist literature, I found that 90% of Buddhists were formerly Brahmins. Brahmins frequently came to discuss and debate with the Buddha, and when they lost, they often placed their trust in the Buddha and eventually accepted Buddhism. Buddhist literature is full of such events. Thus, Buddhism, a religion that flourished among the vast majority of Brahmins, was later destroyed by the same Brahmins. In our view, the primary reason for this was the worship of family deities. In India, like village and water deities, family deities were also worshipped by the Brahmins. The priests who worshipped these deities began to influence state affairs through the queens. After converting to Buddhism, King Ashoka abandoned this worship and removed the idols used in such worship. King Ashoka said, "When I honor the Buddha, the Enlightened One, there is no need to worship any other deity." This action by King Ashoka deeply worried the Brahmins as it ended their means of livelihood in unjust exploitation. They vowed to take revenge for this loss. The Brahmins believed, after death, kings would fall into hell for their mistakes and shortcomings. Therefore, they did not want to be rulers, but preferred to be the supreme advisors to the kings. To avenge their loss due to the cessation of family deity worship, Kula Puja, the Brahmins abandoned their motto of being advisors and sought to seize power. With the support of the Kshatriyas, they established a Brahmin-Kshatriya axis against Buddhism. The resurgence of Brahmanism in India was one of the causes of Buddhism's decline. The prominence of Buddhism, which lowered the Brahmin caste, also led to the demise of the sacred rights of the Kshatriya kings. Therefore, there is no doubt that the Kshatriyas who initially supported Buddhism later opposed it. As one writer noted, the Kshatriyas feared Buddhism because it threatened the foundation and existence of their caste, as the oppressed were encouraged by the teachings of equality to rise up. Thus, to safeguard their interests, the ambitious Kshatriyas conspired with the Brahmins and took steps to strengthen the caste system. By mutual arrangement, the Kshatriyas agreed to be kings and the Brahmins to be ministers. This compromise ensured power and prestige for both castes and the perpetual subjugation of other castes, which Buddhism would never tolerate. Therefore, to maintain political power in their hands, these two castes formed a united front against Buddhism, hindering its development. Inciting hatred, the religion of the Buddha was a thorn in the side of reactionary Brahmins because it toppled the priestly caste from its high position, which had ensured them every privilege and material comfort for centuries. Therefore, when the influence of Buddhism waned, they retaliated and attacked Buddhism in various ways to avenge their loss. They used the most vile language and the dirtiest tricks to demean and denigrate Buddhism in the eyes of the public. They even distorted the meanings of Buddhist words and phrases. We hope that the critical analysis in the following sections will help readers understand the importance of our discussion. 1. King Ashoka, the greatest Buddhist king, in his edicts referred to himself as Devanam Priya, meaning beloved of the gods, but Brahmin grammarians twisted this term to mean a fool loved by the gods. R.K. Mukherjee spoke of this degradation as follows. Regarding the phrase Devanam Priya Priyadarsi, V.A. Smith's translation as divine and gracious one is the most accurate. Devanam Priya instead of Deva Priya might be a term intended to disrespect Panini's rules, but it is mentioned in exceptions except for rules by Katyayana, around 359 BCE according to R.G. Bhadarkar, supported by Patanjali, 150 BCE, and even Kasikar, 650 CE. However, the exception does not allow later grammarians like Batoji Dikshiter, who emphasized viewing the term Devanam Priya as derogatory, implying a fool, murkha, ignorant of Brahma. Thus, a title praised during the Nanda, Maurya, and Sangha eras had its meaning degraded due to the Brahmin bias against the illustrious Buddhist king. 2. The Buddha entered nirvana in Kushinagar in the Deoria district of Uttar Pradesh, located 12 miles east of Gorakhpur and 21 miles from Deoria. It lies on the western bank of the Hiranyavati River, corresponding to the broad area of Rambar Katilar on the west bank of Lake Rambar. The words Hiranyavati and Rambar could have combined to form the name Harambar for this region. Kushinagar, where the Buddha achieved parinirvana, became a significant and sacred pilgrimage site for Buddhists. Naturally, Buddhists from all over India gathered here in large numbers annually to pay their respects to the Master. It seems the Brahmins were disturbed by the populace at Kushinagar. They employed cunning religious strategies and taught the ignorant householders that those who died in Harambar, the area around Kushinagar, would be condemned to hell or reborn as a female donkey, while those who died in Kasi Varanasi would go to heaven. To support our viewpoint, we have compelling historical evidence from the life of Mahatma Kabir, a religious and social reformer of the 15th century. During his time, the harmful propaganda mentioned above was rampant. Kabir strongly opposed this nonsensical view. He declared that if a person's actions were good, they would surely attain salvation, whether they died in Kasi or Harambar. And to prove his belief in the fallacy and meaninglessness of the Harambar myth, Kabir, in his old age, deliberately traveled to the Forbidden Land and died in 1518 CE in a small town called Magar in the Gorakhpur region, not far from Kushinagar. Kabir, in his writings, mentioned this event twice and fully explained his pilgrimage to Magar, despite strong objections from his friends and admirers. Based on this event, Westcott wrote in his credible work on Kabir, "It was the disciples' wish that Kabir did not end his life in Kasi, where many religious works had been completed. They claimed that all people who died in Kasi would immediately be reborn in the realm of Ram, and those who died in Magar would return to this world and be reborn as female donkeys." Kabir ridiculed their belief. Could Ram's power be so limited that he could not save his devotee because he wanted to die outside Kasi, the city of Shiva? The anxiety and fear among Hindus were so strong that after Kabir died in Magar, they could not abandon their superstition. Therefore, they did not build a memorial temple for Kabir there, but instead erected one in Kasi. The Muslims built a memorial for Kabir in Magar, his final resting place. The main shrine in Magar has always been managed by Muslims and continues to be under their care, even though a temple for Hindus has been built there. 3. Fanatic Brahmins did not stop there. They continued to incite hatred and animosity towards Buddhists over the centuries and maintained this spirit in literature. Here are some examples. O. Nikat, in his work Prayaskit Mayuka, quoted a verse from Manu, the Code of Manu. If someone touches a Buddhist or a follower of Panchupat, Lokayataka, Nastika, or Mahapataki, they must bathe to purify themselves. The same doctrine was taught by Aprika in Smriti. Radhaharit went further, declaring that entering a Buddhist temple was a sin requiring a bath to cleanse oneself. The most impressive example of this attitude towards Buddhists is found in the play Michakatika. In Act 7, the hero Charadatta and his friend Maitreya are waiting for Vasantasena in the square outside Ujjain. She does not arrive, and Charadatta decides to leave the square. As they leave, they see a Buddhist monk named Sambhakaha. Seeing him, Charadatta says, "Friend Maitreya, I am eager to meet Vasantasena. Let's go," after walking a few steps. This is an unlucky sight. A Buddhist monk is coming towards us. After pondering a bit, "Well, let him take this path and we will take another." They exit the stage. In Act 8, the monk is in the great garden of Sakara, the king's brother-in-law. Seeing the monk's robe in a pond, Sakara, followed by Vita, gets up and threatens to kill the monk. Here's their dialogue. Sakara, "Stop, you wretched monk." This is the king's brother-in-law. Because some monks insulted the king beats any monk he meets. "Stop, I will break your head like one breaks an amaranth stalk in a shop." He beats him. "Friend, it is not right to beat a monk who has renounced the world. Please, be kind, layperson." "Friend, look, he insults me." "What did he say?" "He called me a layperson." "Am I a barber?" "Oh, he actually praised you as a devotee of the Buddha." "Why did you come here?" "To wash these clothes." You vile monk, even I do not bathe in this pond. I will kill you with a beating." After being beaten severely, the monk is let go. This was a Buddhist monk in a crowd of Hindus. He was shunned and avoided. The feeling of disgust towards him was so great that people avoided the path he walked. The feeling of intense loathing was such that the entrance of a Buddhist caused Hindus to leave. Brahmins were exempt from capital punishment and even corporal punishment. But Buddhist monks were beaten and tortured mercilessly, without remorse, as if it were not wrong to do so. Chanalya Kautilya, a famous Brahmin minister under King Chandragupta of the Maurya dynasty, was also part of the campaign to incite hatred against Buddhism. He said, "Oh, when someone partakes in a meal offered to gods and ancestors, members of the Shakya clan, Buddhists, Ajivikas, Shudras, and exiles must be punished with a fine of 100 panas." The authors of the Puranas, sacred texts, also propagated anti-Buddhist sentiments. They viewed the Buddha as an avatar, incarnation of Vishnu, but treated him with disdain. The Brahmanardiya Purana considers it a great sin for a Brahmin to enter the house of a Buddhist, even if it involves great danger. The Agni Purana states that the son of King Sudana, the Buddha, seduced the Daityas into becoming Buddhists. The Vayu Purana speaks disdainfully of Buddhism. With white teeth, direct gaze, shaven head, and red robes, the Shudras will perform religious acts. The Vishnu Purana refers to the Buddha as the great seducer. They saw him as a Mahamoha, appearing in the world to deceive demons. It also warns against conversing with Buddhists, stating that those who talk with shaven-headed ascetics will fall into hell. For as part of their strategy to discredit Buddhists, Hindus used another method to undermine the reputation of Buddhist temples and monasteries. They gave filthy and derogatory names to Buddhist temples and monasteries. For example, the ruins of the stupa at Ghantasila in Andhra Pradesh were called Langa Diba, meaning the mound of prostitutes. Such derogatory names for ancient Buddhist sites were cited by ignorant scholars as reasons for Buddhism's disappearance in India, claiming that its temples had become depraved places and the monks lived unworthy lives. They argued, "Oh, the places of worship of Buddhism became morally degraded, causing people to despise and abandon them." We agree that when temples began to prosper, some Buddhist monks became self-indulgent and neglected their duties to the spiritual and social needs of the public. They began to live comfortably in monasteries and did not engage in the ideal of social service. This ultimately affected the propagation and maintenance of the Dharma to some extent. However, to claim that Buddhism declined because of the moral collapse of the Sangha is unfounded. There is no evidence to support this argument, except for the dubious names associated with certain locations. In our view, those derogatory names were created by extremist Hindus intending to discredit Buddhist temples. But for such insidious propaganda, there is no argument to justify the baseless labels attached to sacred Buddhist sites. V.R. Narla said, "It is indeed shocking and sad that not only in Ghantasila but also in Gudivada, Badiprolu, Chinaganjam, Petaganjam, and several other places, the remnants of sacred Buddhist temples are given filthy names like Langa Diba and Bojamadani Diba. An exception that I know of is the stupa at Amaravati. Its local name is Dipala Din, meaning the mound of lights. But even the lights might not necessarily indicate praise, as in practice, all places with mounds of Buddhist relics have a local tradition of prostitutes residing on the mound using lights as signals. The derogatory names attached to Buddhist relics may indicate the suppression of Buddhism by fanatic Hindus later, or perhaps mark the decline of Buddhism in its final form of Vajrayana or Sahajayana, forms not unlike esoteric licentious practices. Of the two reasons, we believe the former more. To demonstrate the absurdity of the latter argument, we invite readers to recall the more degenerate practices within Hindu temples. We do not intend to list a long catalogue of the crimes of Brahmin priests in those days. The following excerpt from an article by Ishwar Singh Bais suffices to reflect life in Hindu temples of old. He wrote, "The temple dancers were ranked second. They were devdasis or slaves of the gods, but they were commonly known by the vulgar name of prostitutes. In reality, they were dedicated to their profession, offering favors to anyone who requested and was willing to pay. Initially, they were set aside for the pleasure of the Brahmin priests. These women, known for their beauty, were especially dedicated to serving Hindu deities. Their main duties included dancing and singing in the temple twice daily, morning and evening, during public ceremonies. The rest of their time was spent in more shameful activities, often converting even sacred temples into brothels. Furthermore, few temples did not claim the right to treat women's infertility. Priests often advised women to stay overnight at the temple, where they said the deity, moved by their devotion, might visit them in spirit and engage in intercourse. Through this trick, the priests satisfied their lust. In addition to the activities within Hindu temples mentioned, The importance of sexual relations in Hinduism is evident in the lewd scenes depicted on the walls of temples like those at Konark in Khajuraho. Regarding the sculptures at Konark, A.L. Basham noted in The Wonder That Was India, the openly licentious nature of many sculptures at Konark has given the Black Pagoda a notorious reputation. Maithuna figures, couples embracing or engaged in intercourse, are common decorative features in many Hindu temples, but those at Konark are particularly lively. The sculptures at Khajuraho are similar. Thus, we can say without hesitation that if moral standards were degraded anywhere, it was in the dwellings of Hindu gods and goddesses. Indeed, as Ishwar Singh Bais noted, in many temples and from the 8th century CE onwards, in most Hindu temples, corruption began, and the temple life turned into hell. Priests sacrificed nobility and morality, retaining only greed and lust. If Hinduism could flourish in such a corrupt atmosphere, the disappearance of Buddhism is not clear, even if there was some decline in moral standards among the devout. Therefore, we do not accept this. Consequently, we firmly assert that attributing the decline of Buddhism to the moral decay of its temples is unfounded and malicious, and the reasons for Buddhism's decline must be found elsewhere. Persecution. One of the main reasons for the rapid decline and collapse of Buddhism in India was the persecution by both rulers and fanatics. Pushyamitra, a Brahmin general under Brihadratha, the last king of the Maurya dynasty, was the first to persecute Buddhism. He assassinated the king in 085 BCE, usurped the throne of Magadha, and ruled with terror. Another Hindu king who oppressed Buddhism was Sasanka, the king of Gadha, Bengal. His first act of treachery was the murder of Rajavardhana in 605 CE, the brother of Harsha, the last Buddhist emperor. Sasanka was a Brahmin and a devout follower of Shiva. In his fanaticism, he destroyed the Bodhi tree. When Xuanzang visited Bodh Gaya in 637 CE, about 3 generations after this event, he recorded, "In the period after Sasanka Raja, a heretic who slandered Buddhism out of jealousy, destroyed the monasteries and cut down the Bodhi tree, digging down to the water level, but he could not reach the roots. Then he burned it with fire and soaked it with sugarcane juice, intending to annihilate it completely. He also removed the statue of the Buddha from the temple near the Bodhi tree and replaced it with a figure of Shiva. Furthermore, he threw the sacred stone with the Buddha's footprint into the Ganges at Pataliputra. To complete his evil schemes, Sasanka is said to have exterminated monks in the area of Kushinagar. One of the greatest persecutors of Buddhism was Mihirakula, the Hunnic ruler, who inflicted significant damage on Buddhist monasteries in Gandhara, Punjab, and Kashmir. Mihirakula, a devotee of Shiva and a major patron of Brahmanism, demolished 1,600 monasteries, stupas, and temples, and killed hundreds of lay Buddhists in his madness. Toramana, another ruler from the same cruel dynasty, is known to have destroyed the monastery of Gostarama in Kausambi. Regarding the persecution of Buddhism in Kashmir, F.M. Hussain wrote, "It was Nara who initiated the extermination of Buddhism in Kashmir. He burned down Buddhist monasteries in Kashmir and exterminated the Buddhist populace by confiscating their lands and distributing them to the Brahmins." What happened in Kashmir was part of the larger process of the extermination of Buddhism in the country. In the struggle between Buddhism and Brahmanism, Brahmanism emerged victorious, and under those circumstances, the annihilation of Buddhism in Kashmir was only a matter of time. Hussain further noted, Pravarasena took power around the late 6th century. He had to repel attacks from Mamuni, a Muslim chieftain from Central Asia. He built the city of Pravarasenanagar with temples dedicated to 5 goddesses. His uncle Jayendra built a famous monastery called Jayendra Vihara, which housed a massive statue of the Buddha. Xuanzang visited this monastery during his stay in Kashmir. This monastery was burned down by Shemagupta, who melted the giant statue to use it for his temple of Shiva. Another adversary of Buddhism was Kumarila Bhatt, a Brahmin who lived in the 7th century CE. He referred to the Buddha's teachings as useless, comparing them to the pus oozing from a dog's skin. According to his suggestion, Sudanvan, the king of Ujjain, is said to have exterminated Buddhists. The brutal persecution of Buddhists by Sudanvan, incited by Kumarila Bhatt, is recorded in 2 biographies of Sankaracharya, Sankara Vijaya by Anandagiri, a direct disciple of Sankaracharya, and Sankara Digvijayam by Madhava, 14th century. Madhava Acharya confirmed that, prompted by Kumarila Bhatt, Sudanvan ordered the killing of all Buddhists from Ramesvaram to the Himalayas and decreed that those who did not kill Buddhists would be executed. Sankaracharya, a Vedanta philosopher, was also responsible for the persecution of Buddhism. Indeed, he instilled terror in the minds of Buddhists. According to Tibetan tradition, when he arrived, Buddhists in monasteries began to disperse. He once wrote in his Bhashya of the Brahma Sutras that the Buddha was an enemy of the people and taught contradictory and confusing doctrines. The method used by Hindus to oust Buddhism from its birthplace is illuminated in the myth of Gayasura, recorded in the Gaya Mahatmya, part of the Vayu Purana. According to the myth, Gayasura, the demon, attained such divine status that anyone who saw or touched him would ascend to heaven. Yama, the god of death, out of jealousy, petitioned the gods to diminish Gayasura's power. The gods requested Gaya's pure and holy body for a sacrifice. Gaya complied and lay down with his head in the position now known as Gaya. The gods placed a stone on his head, but this was insufficient to keep him still. Finally, Gaya Asura became immobile when Vishnu sat on the stone to prevent his movement, and promised that the stone on his head would be proclaimed the most sacred place on earth. The gods would rest on the stone. It would be named Gaya Kshetra. And those who offered cakes and funerary rites and performed funeral ceremonies, there would attain blessings and their ancestors would ascend to heaven, the abode of Brahma. The age of the Gaya Asura myth is uncertain. Regardless of the claims of Orthodox Hindus about its antiquity, it is evident that Gaya was elevated to its current status in the Hindu world only after Buddhism's decline in India. Dr. Rajendralal Mitra, a scholar with a unique historical perspective, believed that the incredible myth in the Vayu Purana symbolized the ultimate victory of Brahmanism over Buddhism, which had flourished in and around Gaya for centuries. He wrote, "Hindus believe the story to be literally true, but Dr. Buchanan called it a grotesque fable, and it might well be. At first glance, nothing could be more absurd and foolish than the story. It violates every sense of propriety, and even its storytelling has no factual value. Brahmayoni Hill, also known as Mount Kalahalar, is 3 miles long, and imagining placing a person 125 yojanas, 576 miles tall, and 268 miles in circumference on it is impossible, even for the most impoverished mind. A head 1 mile in circumference on a body 576 miles tall is like a pinhead on a human body. The god's inability to hold down a lying demon and their futile efforts to keep him from moving are childish. Given these circumstances, one must question, how could the author of the Vayu Purana, of which Gaya Mahatmya is a part, create such a childish story to ensure public reverence and devotion to this place? He was not lacking in intelligence, as he discussed complex philosophical issues with notable skill and dexterity. It is unreasonable to think that he could not distinguish between rationality and childish absurdity. Thus, dismissing this story as absurdity, in my opinion, is a hasty conclusion and a sign of impatience. We must adopt the perspective of a philosophical historian to assume there is something hidden behind the external shell of the story, with a symbolic meaning. I believe, and it is evident, that this story is an allegory of the triumph of Brahmanism over Buddhism. Gaya is called an asura, typically meaning a giant, demon, tempter, or one who curses the gods and religion, but it is not depicted as such. It does not indulge in sin, harm anyone, or speak or act against the gods or religion. On the contrary, it is portrayed as a devotee of Vishnu, dedicated to rigorous penance, prolonged meditation, and extreme bodily and mental purification, one whose mere touch could cleanse the greatest sins of mankind and ensure entry to heaven. The most serious accusation against it is making salvation too simple and quick. In its case, therefore, it means it did not follow the Brahminical faith or their path, and in short, it was a heretic. This nature has always been attributed to leaders in the Buddhist community. They are devout, ascetic, committed to penance and meditation, but they shun Brahminical sacrifices and rituals, and thus Gaya could be seen as personifying Buddhism. Its body measuring 576 by 268 miles, encompassing the area from Kalinga to the Himalayas and from central India to Bengal, where Buddhism spread when the story was written, covers that vast space and even more. The headquarters of Buddhism was Gaya, and the town of Gaya, even today, has a width of 1 mile. The god's attempts to place the demon's head down are emblematic of the Hindu efforts to attack Buddhism at its inspirational center, the headquarters, and Vishnu's club symbolizes the methods used when persuasion failed. The religious rock placed on the heretic's head, the god's strength keeping it fixed and unmovable, is the divine blessing that sanctified Buddhism's cradle into a Hindu sanctuary. We know too well the means used in Puri, Bhubaneswara, and other places to appropriate Buddhist symbols. Buddhist sacred sites, and even Buddhist images became useful for Hindu worship, and it is not unreasonable to assume the same process was applied at Gaya. Beyond the persecution by kings and religious entities, Buddhism also faced societal oppression and ostracism. It is evident that as Buddhism began to decline, Hindus took advantage of the poverty of Buddhists, allowing them to rejoin Hindu society but condemning them as untouchables, placing them in the lowest tier outside the 4 castes of Hinduism. They were entirely excommunicated from society and labeled as Pariya, Pamchama, Avarna, and Ati Shudra, those whose touch or even shadow would defile the Hindu caste. They were forced to live outside the villages and became targets for various social abuses. They were denied education and relegated to the lowest and dirtiest jobs. They were not only prohibited from using wells, water reservoirs, and public places, but also denied property rights. In short, they were treated as slaves, with no choice but to serve the so-called higher castes without any rewards. Undoubtedly, oppressed by poverty, coupled with societal exploitation and repression, Buddha's disciples forgot their glorious heritage and succumbed to their miserable fate. The harsh treatment of untouchables, now the marginalized castes by Hindu society, can only be explained as a result of prejudice and hatred against Buddhism. Otherwise, why would a large group of people be deprived of resources and condemned as untouchables, those who cannot be approached, spoken to, or touched? The fact that the untouchables or the marginalized castes in India today were once Buddhists can be demonstrated. First, most of their customs and characteristics have Buddhist roots. Second, they are not particularly interested in Hindu deities. Like Buddhists, they worship Buddha, their greatest teacher, and venerate figures like Ravidas, Chokamela, Kabir, etc. Thus, like Buddhists, they are guru worshippers, Gubaju, rather than deity worshippers, Devbaju, like Hindus. Third, some marginalized castes in Punjab, Himachal Pradesh, Delhi, and Rajasthan call themselves Ad-Dharmi or Adi-Dharmi. The term Ad means ancient or original, and Ad-Dharmi believe they follow an ancient religion. Undoubtedly, these terms have Buddhist origins, as they resemble Buddhist terms like Adi-Buddha and Adi-Dharma, which, according to Mahayana tradition, represent wisdom or mind and matter. Moreover, Buddhists have long referred to their religion as Dharma or Siddharma, and Buddhists in Orissa call themselves Mahima Dharmi, followers of the glorious Dharma. Indeed, these people were Buddhists in the past. What seems to have happened later is that, due to persecution and lack of education, they forgot the name of the Buddha, or perhaps abandoned the name of the Dharma king to avoid further suffering. As the poet Achyutananda in 16th century Orissa consoled them by saying that due to the desirability in Kali Yuga, Buddhists had to disguise themselves. The Muslim invasions accelerated Buddhism's downfall in India. When the Muslims arrived, they had 2 objectives: first, to gain political power; second, to propagate Islam. To achieve the second goal, they planned to eradicate Buddhist and Hindu temples, as well as the Buddhist monks and Brahmin priests, who were the custodians of religious thought. They were particularly opposed to Buddhist monks, who propagated the Buddha's message of equality. This tendency was planned because Muslims found it difficult to preach their message of equality against the backdrop of similar Buddhist teachings. Therefore, fanatical Muslims razed monasteries and exterminated most monks in these monasteries. The few who escaped the Muslim sword fled for their lives and sought refuge in neighboring countries. 2 notable Muslim rulers who devastated Buddhist sanctuaries were Mahmud Ghazni and Bakhtiar Khilji. The former plundered Buddhist temples in Katkangra, Himachal Pradesh, in the 10th century, and the latter destroyed the monasteries of Nalanda, Vikramashila, and Odantapuri, vibrant until the 12th century. Regarding the Muslim invasion, Dr. Ambedkar stated, "The Muslim invaders plundered universities like Nalanda, Vikramasila, Jagadala, and Odantapuri. They uprooted Buddhist monasteries scattered throughout the country. Thousands of monks fled to Nepal, Tibet, and other countries outside India. A large number were killed by Muslim soldiers. The massacre of Buddhist monks under the sword of Muslim invaders is recorded by Muslim historians. Summarizing the documents related to the slaughter of Buddhist monks by Muslim generals during the invasion of Bihar in 1197 CE, Vincent Smith wrote, "The Muslim general made his name known in terror during his repeated plundering expeditions in Bihar, seizing the capital with daring attacks." A contemporary historian, meeting one of the survivors of the 1243 CE raid, learned that the fortress of Bihar was captured by a small force of just 200 cavalry who stormed the eastern gate with great bravery and seized the position. A large amount of loot was collected, and the massacre of shaven-headed Brahmins, referring to Buddhist monks, was complete. When the victors searched for someone to interpret the books in the monastery's library, no one was found alive who could read them. It was discovered that the entire fortress of the city was a college, referred to as Bihar in Hindu terminology. Such was the massacre of Buddhist monks by Muslim invaders. In their bid to eradicate Buddhism, Muslims killed Buddhist monks. This was the greatest terror that led to the decline of Buddhism in India. Like any other ideology, religion can only be sustained through propagation. If propagation fails, religion must disappear. The Muslim sword struck down the monks. They were either exterminated or fled abroad. No one remained to keep the flame of Buddhism burning. Some Hindu zealots took advantage of the chaos caused by Muslims in their conquest of Buddhist worship places in Bihar. This was vividly described by Dharmasvaman, a Tibetan pilgrim who visited Bihar about 3 generations after the disaster. According to him, Ratnabodhi, the largest library in Nalanda, escaped destruction by Muslims but was burned by Hindu mendicants. He wrote, "They, the Hindus, conducted a yajna, fire sacrifice, and threw embers and ashes from the sacrificial pit into Buddhist temples, etc. This caused a great fire that consumed Ratnabodhi, the 9-story library of Nalanda University." The fact that Hindu opponents of Buddhism did not hesitate to destroy Buddhist sanctuaries elsewhere is evident from the remains, burned images, and bones of monks found by archaeologists in Sarnath and nearby areas. Clearly, the temples were burned by fanatics, and this seemed to have happened repeatedly, as Major Kitto, who conducted excavations in Sarnath in 1851, stated, "Everything was looted and burned, monks, temples, statues, all together, for in some places bones, iron, wood, and stone were found in large masses, and this happened multiple times." The decline of Buddhist centers was a death blow to Buddhists, who could not recover their lost ground. Therefore, in the subsequent centuries, Buddhism was neglected by its followers on one hand, and thousands of its temples were destroyed, looted, or appropriated by its opponents on the other. Buddhist structures continued to be destroyed and looted for centuries for material gain, as evidenced by the following excerpts. 1. The magnificent Bharhut Stupa in Madhya Pradesh, named and famous worldwide for the finest examples of Indian art and sculpture of the 2nd century CE, was dismantled by ignorant locals for bricks to build their houses. Cunningham, who discovered and excavated the stupa in 1873-74, noted that the village of Bharhut today consists of about 200 houses, all entirely built with bricks from the stupa. The actions of Bharhut villagers were imitated by neighboring villages. They dismantled many pillars and railings to construct their houses. Cunningham discovered 6 pillars in the nearby village of Bhattanmara and 8 in Pathora. He also found numerous sculpted stones that once formed the railings of the stupa in most of the larger villages around Bharhut, particularly in Uchahara, Bhattamara, Pathora, and Madhogar, or Patharhat. 2. The Dharmarajika stupa at Sarnath was dismantled by Jagat Singh in 1794 to obtain bricks for building a market in Varanasi. This market is now known as Jagat Ganj. Ashoka's pillar was also shattered. 3. Regarding the famous Amaravati stupa in Andhra Pradesh, V.R. Narla, an authority on Buddhist art in Andhra, noted, "Most of the remains today are unfortunately gone. Even in the time of Colonel Colin Mackenzie, who saw the stupa at the end of the 18th century, Many carved stone pieces had already been destroyed. They were dug up and burned into lime by the local leader who, in 1797, moved his headquarters to Amaravati, the ashes of its historically significant and sanctified remains, and made a feeble attempt to build a new city near the Amritsar temple. Even the sculptures that escaped this cultural destruction are now scattered in various places. Number 4. In 1840, the Buddhist stupa at Gudivada in Andhra Pradesh was destroyed to obtain materials for repairing the road between Bezwada and Bandar. Referring to this cultural destruction, Mr. Raya wrote, "It is regrettable that all these structures had to suffer destruction at the hands of those seeking materials for building roads and similar works." Although these ancient architectural remains are relics of a bygone civilization, their ancientness did not protect them from the hands of vandals. Buddhism being assimilated, to effectively counter Buddhism, Hinduism began early to modify and transform itself. In doing so, they equipped their system with the admirable qualities of Buddhism, both in theory and practice. In this process of reform, Hindus adopted the ideal of non-violence, ahimsa, and abandoned animal sacrifices. They also began to organize themselves in a manner similar to Buddhist monasteries. Furthermore, to end the prolonged and challenging verbal battles to gain dominance, they incorporated Lord Buddha into the Hindu pantheon as an avatar incarnation of the god Vishnu. This was proclaimed to the general public by the authors of the Puranas. According to the Varaha Purana, by following the vow of Buddhavadasi, King Suddhodana was blessed with a son in the form of Buddha by the god Vishnu. Buddha is regarded as an avatar of Vishnu in the Matsya, Bhagavata, Garuda, and Linga Puranas. Not only this, but the followers of Shiva also integrated the monastic and contemplative elements of Buddhism, while the followers of Vishnu incorporated the devotional and humanitarian aspects of Buddhism to ensure their appeal among the masses. The Vishnu worshippers also revised their stance on the caste system, accepting it as a social institution devoid of any religious or spiritual pursuit. As Dr. Radhakrishnan stated, a gradual process of infiltration and modification developed, supporting the view that Mahayana Buddhism was just a sectarian phase within the broader Vishnu worship movement, while Theravada Buddhism, with its ascetic nature, was considered a sect of Shiva worship. When Brahminical faith deeply ingrained compassion for all beings and devotion to deities and declared that Buddha was an incarnation of Vishnu, the death knell for Buddhism in India had sounded. Internal causes. Besides the external causes, which were undoubtedly the main reasons for the decline and disappearance of Buddhism, there were also some internal limitations and mistakes that hastened its ultimate disappearance from its homeland. We must acknowledge that the Buddhists themselves bear a significant responsibility for the unfortunate fate of their religion. The Buddha had outlined a path for monks to not only seek enlightenment through practicing moral and spiritual precepts, but also to serve society as friends, philosophers, and guides to the masses. The Buddha was the first religious teacher in India, or perhaps in the world, to encourage his disciples to travel far and wide for the happiness and benefit of many. Furthermore, he was the first to introduce the ideal of self-sacrifice and service to others. He taught that a monk should beg for food, live on alms, and limit himself to one meal a day. Following their teacher's instructions, the early monks reached the highest standards of devotion, self-sacrifice, and service. This led to the glorious achievement of Buddhism becoming the most popular and respected religion in India. However, unfortunately, the later monks did not maintain these standards. As monasteries grew wealthy, their primary activity became the study of texts rather than propagating the Dharma. Monks lost close contact with the laity, and the relationship between monks and laypeople deteriorated. Monks became neglectful and passive towards practical objectives, weakening Buddhism. The condition of the Sangha in the final years of Buddhism's glory in India can be assessed from the words of Cunningham, one of the greatest archaeologists, explorers, and scholars. He stated, "Buddhism had indeed become an old and exhausted faith. The monks no longer went out to beg, but had long been supported by lands assigned to the monasteries. The Shramanas and Bhikshus were not like the men of old, who were learned and wise, whose bodily restraint and mental concentration coupled with practical tenets and exemplary purity, had excited the devotion of the people. The modern Buddhists had fallen into decay. They were content to live a passive life amidst the dull routine of monastic life, where a few outward signs of religion remained, but the earnestness and enthusiasm that had once burned in every Buddhist monk for propagating their religion had long since been extinguished. In ancient times, monks and monasteries were the lifeblood of Buddhism. It flourished as long as the monasteries existed, and monks were diligent. Once the monks became indifferent and lost sight of their mission, Buddhism declined, and when the monasteries fell prey to cultural destruction, Buddhism collapsed entirely. Many Buddhist scriptures, mostly kept in monasteries, also vanished in India due to the destruction of the monasteries. The reason was that Buddhists did not have lay organizations to teach, propagate, and protect their religion. In the absence of such organizations, they could only stand by helplessly as monasteries were looted, desecrated, and monks were expelled or killed. The absence of customs and rituals for social ceremonies like weddings, etc., in Buddhism was also a factor in its decline in India. The Buddha opposed ritualism and the monopoly of the Brahmins as priests, not allowing monks to act as priests in social ceremonies. There were no special ceremonies for birthdays, weddings, etc. prescribed. Thus, lay people continued to follow prevailing customs and ceremonies, mostly dictated by the Brahmins. This non-interfering attitude of Buddhism, as Dr. Joshi stated, while facilitating the smooth spread of the religion, ultimately resulted in reducing its influence in society over the long run. Another internal cause that paved the way for Buddhism's decline was the excessive indulgence of enthusiastic Mahayana followers in Hindu superstitions. To widely propagate their faith, they not only deified and multiplied the Buddha, but also introduced several Hindu gods and goddesses as Buddhist deities, in the form of bodhisattvas embodying the powers of the Buddha. This made Buddhism indistinguishable, except in name, from Hindu deities, erasing the distinction between the two religions. And when Hinduism incorporated the Buddha into its pantheon of gods to demonstrate that Buddhism was a sect of Hinduism, Buddhism lost its unique identity. Conclusion: the loss of royal patronage can be considered another reason for the rapid decline of Buddhism. For example, it took over 200 years for Buddhism to establish strong roots and become a major social liberation movement in its homeland. This happened with the advent of Emperor Ashoka in the 3rd century BCE. However, within 50 years of Ashoka's death in 232 BCE, the Maurya Empire collapsed, and Buddhism lost royal patronage, which did not return until 300 years later with the reign of Kanishka in 78 CE. With the collapse of the Kushan dynasty in the 2nd century CE, Buddhism again lost royal support. The post-Kushan period was marked by political chaos, eventually leading to the rise of the Gupta dynasty in Magadha. The Gupta rulers were followers of Brahmanism, and their reign marked the revival of Brahmanism. The last powerful patron of Buddhism was King Harsha, who came to power in 606 CE, 500 years after Kanishka. After Harsha's death in 647 CE, Buddhism again lost royal patronage and never regained it on a large scale. Once royal patronage ceased and was replaced by royal and religious oppression, the last stronghold of Buddhism fell faster than could be imagined. What remained that had not been destroyed by reactionary Hindus was wiped out by fanatic Muslims. As one writer put it, the final act in the drama of Buddhism on its homeland stage began with terror and ended in silence, a forgotten silence. Sacred sites lay in ruins, overgrown by forests, its monasteries converted to other religions. The Buddha disappeared into the multitude of Hindu gods and out of human memory. Regardless of the reasons leading to the decline and disappearance of Buddhism from India, one thing is certain. It was most unfortunate that the religion of the Buddha, the first global religion, lost its influence in its homeland. This event resulted in India paying a high price, a historical truth. India flourished as long as Buddhism remained a vibrant religion, but with its decline, India lost its spirit of freedom, its reputation diminished, and its progress was hindered. Thank you for listening. If you found this video helpful, please share it with those who might benefit from it. Don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comment section below. Hit the like button, follow, and turn on the notification bell. This is how you can show your support for me. Once again, thank you very much, and see you in the next videos.